I'm Phil Reed, and this is going to be the audiobook review of Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. This book was recommended to me by a friend, Mackenzie Knapp, and I'm so glad to have her here today to have a chat with me about the book.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Knapp. I'm a good friend of Phil's. We had a really good conversation over dinner one night all about Outliers. It's a phenomenal book that has shaped my life. I am in AI. I'm all about figuring out the patterns of why people do what they do. And if you think about statistics and the distribution curve and these outliers, why do we react so strongly to some of these outliers, and how do they make a differentiator for success?
Great. Why don't we start, tell me a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I've got a background that is basically in AI, and I've been doing that for the last 10 to 15 years. I started out learning from the founder of Adobe Analytics, and so it was all about how do you measure what people are doing, and how do you use behavioral psychology to understand that and get them to do something more. For a long time, it was helping people to just buy more, and I feel like in AI that gets a little bit monotonous and doesn't always feel great. So I feel like now with the advent of true AI, it's about using AI to actually better people's lives. So I'm helping a lot of companies that are in health, helping big companies like Mercedes or Apple or so on and so forth. So it's a little bit what I do and why I love Malcolm Gladwell and his books, because it's got a lot of that behavioral science component to it of figuring out why people do what they do and then trying to better our world through those learnings.
Cool. And so you recommended this book, Outliers, to me. How did you first discover it?
I discovered it, I think I was 18, and I heard he's a really good orator. He has a way of...
TED Talks.
He does TED Talks, and he's got an unusual style. So he's just very captivating in how he tells stories. I think Malcolm Gladwell is probably one of the best storytellers of our generation. And I remember Hush Puppies being a thing in trends, and I was very into fashion, and so I always wanted to know, why do certain trends take off and other trends don't?
Right.
And his whole book was just about dissecting, why did Hush Puppies take off this really ugly shoe that no one thought was cute, and then it came back. And it's kind of like, as you know, your kids know, Crocs, and now they're back, and I think they're so ugly, but yet there's a reason behind all of these trends if you look deep enough.
I've heard that story, although that wasn't part of the Outliers book, right?
Yeah, so I've probably read every single one of his books, so he'll talk about some of these underlying trends. And Outliers in particular was really beautiful because he really broke down what does it mean to be successful. So that was a pivotal moment in my life where I was trying to figure out, how do I become successful? I had actually dropped out of college and was going to go be an entrepreneur in a different way. And I used his book as a big tipping point in my own life of just trying to figure out, how do you get that success factor, and learning from some of those.
Interesting. I actually, in listening to Outliers, because I listen to the audiobook version of it as I do with almost everything I consume, I found the message a little bit depressing. I mean, maybe not depressing, but I think it de-emphasizes an individual's merit, right? And sort of highlights other factors that led to success. I think that's the theme of the book, right? And in a way, I see it as kind of the message being, don't attribute too much credit to any one of these outliers like Bill Gates or Wayne Gretzky or these other uber successful people
that we all really admire.
Because, I think Flom from the Skadden Arps law firm, because they grew up in a specific time, in a specific place, and there were certain factors that led to their success. I think in Bill Gates' case, it was his unique access to computing while he was a teenager, which 99.999% of Americans did not have access to at that point in time.
So circumstances for him, and Wayne Gretzky and when he's born or something,
Wayne Gretzky being born in January, and a lot of the most successful hockey players being born in the first quarter of the year. So it's interesting that you said you were looking at it and said, how can I become successful?
Yeah.
And in a way, the book is like luck of the draw, right? Did you have?
I like this.
If you had, if you were growing up in New York with Jewish parents who themselves grew up during the Depression, you're more likely to have been excluded from the white shoe law firms of that era and had to forge your own path. And so these trends that favored, I think the example he used is like leveraged buyouts, right? Like or aggressive takeovers.
Yeah.
It was seen as like an improper way of doing business. And so all the big law firms in New York were refusing to do it. And there were so many brilliant Jewish lawyers who'd been excluded from these firms that they ended up catching all that work. And that was the new trend that caught fire.
Yeah.
And so it was like they were at the right place at the right time and under the right circumstances. And so, yeah,
I definitely see that perspective, because the whole 10,000 hour rule is ultimately, as long as you work those 10,000 hours, you are at least now at an equal competitive playing field as those other people. And so I feel like in some way for me, that made me feel like if I didn't have the circumstantial differentiators to make me more likely to have success, I could at least work up to that threshold. And then from then on out, what I attributed some of these factors of success, and some of this also comes from some of his other books, like David and Goliath and like dyslexia. And I grew up with a lot of those things.
Okay.
That there are these things that we think are disadvantages, just like the Jewish law firm.
Okay.
They're being excluded, but it ended up giving them a niche. So I feel like
Right.
those disadvantages show us at times where there's actually opportunity that no one else sees as an opportunity yet. And so as long as you put in that minimum threshold to be at an equal playing field, or if I'm 7'10", okay, now I at least have a chance for basketball.
Right.
Now I have to go do all the other differentiator stuff that's going
Right.
to make me exceptional. And so I do think it is about also community, because that's part of one of the things that is talked about as well. So it's circumstantial, the people that you have surrounding you, and are you going to put yourself in circumstances that might give you a competitive advantage? I think you have to put yourself out there in a way that you would never normally get that opportunity. And to me, that's, I think, what made that book exciting. But I see the point of...
Well, I have to say, especially with the hockey player example, growing up in Canada playing hockey,
it crushed your dreams?
It didn't crush my dreams, although I'm born in mid-November. So I'm like the most disfavored category. I'm in the last half of the last quarter of the year. But what I was getting at with that is that there's another way to look at it, which is the system is favoring kids that are born in January, February, March, no doubt about it. But there's a lot of kids born in January, February, and March. So which are the ones that became stellar? And the answer is like the ones who put in 10,000 hours. And he links these things together, saying like if you were born in the first quarter of the year, you're more likely to be selected for those additional programs like the All-Star program or whatever programs that go year-round that give you more opportunities to get your 10,000 hours in. Yeah. More so than if you're born in the second half of the year. But to your point, you can use that information, and I think as a parent, you realize, okay, if my kids are born in the second half of the year and they're not chosen because they're smaller than the other kids at 7 years old, I can still enroll them in extra programs and get them towards those 10,000 hours gradually over time. And by the time they're 14 and they've been included in year-round practices and coaching, they're now on a much more level playing field to other kids. So I think there are implications for how you can structure your life or your decisions to improve your chances.
It's 100% not only just are you correct, and I'm saying that because I took this, I love taking courses, and there's one at UCLA. He's a brilliant economist, and he ultimately took all the data throughout all of Los Angeles, and then he started looking at what made some families more successful. And so we pulled all this data, we did all these data science exercises, and then we actually measured that the things that made certain people have success, GDP and a couple other data points to try and determine like how do you quantify success. But the factors that really did make a difference is that the cultural differences that can sometimes be present and the opportunities that you're given. So throughout a kid's life when they're younger, they're pretty equal. And then once they reach this point where families might be taking them off to different adventures during the summer, that's where the the disadvantage comes.
Right.
And I feel like going back to your point of, opportunities, it's systems. And so if you realize that you have a yearly calendar of how you give kids a 12-month advantage because you're segregating kids based on when you're born.
Right.
Those kids are going to have a total disadvantage. But if you do it on a quarterly system, so I think these types of studies teach us that there is system inequality, and if we fix the system, you level the playing field for so many other people. And that's what, to me, is the beautiful part of that book, I guess, is it teaches you to see the world of, hey, where can we actually fix our systems and things like that.
It's interesting. I'm on the board of AYSO for our region, which is American Youth Soccer, and I was thinking about that too because they're organized into 2-year cohorts as opposed to 1-year cohorts, where every single year, if it's a 1-year cohort, the older kids are going to have some developmental advantages over the younger kids, whereas in 2-year cohorts, there's always like a senior year and a junior year, and each year you flip from being, so for example, if you're 8 years old, you're in the junior cohort, right, of that 8-9-year-old group. And then the following year, you become the senior player, and you're playing, half the players are 8-year-olds and the other half are 9-year-olds. So even if you're born in October or in December, you're still in the half oldest kids of that group. And so by organizing it in 2-year cohorts instead of 1 year, it flips back and forth. And so again, those who were born in January, every second year, they're still in the youngest half of that group. So I feel like that's a way that, and again, that's a community organization that I have no idea whether their implementation was connected to Gladwell's sort of findings and outliers, but it's a system that overcomes sort of those structural deficiencies, I think, that we're talking about. Yeah,
I also think what's fascinating about that is like it just teaches kids that there's times when to be a leader and there's times when to be follower is not the greatest word, but something to the extent of going with the flow and
a student and a teacher, right?
Yeah, exactly. The other part that you made me think of was also right now the social media landscape that we're in. And if you think about, I know I'm geeking out a little too much on this, sorry, but that's
why we're here.
Think about like a distribution curve, if you remember stats, and you have those outliers on topic with the book. But right now you see in social media that we're all reacting to or seeing what's in the comments. And a lot of times when you look in comments, how often are you seeing someone's post that you don't know and just typing something very angry and ferocious?
Probably pretty rarely, but I see it a lot.
You see it a lot, but the irony is that is actually not representative of our community and our culture as in the United States, but yet we see it so often that these tiny little outliers are represented so much and amplified.
I see. That
perception actually becomes reality, and we think our country is represented in this way, when in reality, that's likely not the case. And but yet, it's fascinating how much outlier behavior can become something that seems like a majority just because of how consistent you're seeing it over and over.
Right. I've thought of that in terms of the news spreading so quickly and media picking up on these various stories where, we have 400 million people in this country, right? And a person might do a really horrible thing.
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, like if we go back 100 years, that story would take years to circulate or wouldn't even be talked about because it's so extraordinary and rare and not really relevant to most communities. But now it's sensationalized and it travels instantly at the speed of light. And within 24 hours, everyone in the country has heard about this one exceptional, extraordinarily unlikely thing to reoccur. And then we're trying to figure out, do we need to do something about this? What can we do to prevent this? And it's like, that's a 1 in 400 million situation that's probably never going to happen again. And we have things that are happening every single day in our streets, in our cities that we probably should be paying more attention to.
Yeah.
And these attention grabbing one-off situations, I think, grab an inordinate amount of attention.
I would love if Malcolm Gladwell does a whole new version of Outliers just on that type of behavior that you see in social media and how it's not the things that are not representative of our reality, but they get so much amplification in time in what we talk about. It does distort what becomes reality. And so even though that thing may not need that level of importance, it really shapes our culture. So that's
on the other hand, does talk about something that probably does deserve a lot of attention in the book, and that's airline safety.
Oh yeah.
And
With Korean Air.
I feel sad to say this, but it's pretty remarkable because we were having dinner 2 weeks ago. You recommended this book, and I read it immediately. Like, I read it within a week of our discussion. I read the book, and then within a few days after finishing the book, a South Korean airliner had a disastrous crash. And for those of you who haven't read the book, there's an entire chapter dedicated to what else? South Korean airline disasters. Why? I don't want to kind of give away the plot point, but there's something to do with a factor Gladwell describes as power distance, which is the hierarchical organization of certain societies.
Don't question your leaders.
Don't question your leaders, follow orders, and the importance of status. And it's reassuring to know that in America we have very low power distance, and so people are more willing to challenge leaders and to question assumptions and question orders they're given. But it obviously struck me as a very unfortunate coincidence that there's a chapter dedicated to this, and then within days of reading it, there's a South Korean airline crash.
I do think that's fascinating, even in the American culture, and maybe this wouldn't be the most popular, but what I find fascinating as well is that I've had a lot of culturally diverse employees, and one of which was from Japan, and we talked once about how she felt very uncomfortable to push back, and I said, no, I want you to push back. Like, I'm going to measure your growth in this next quarter about how often you push back, and you're encouraged, and your performance is based on that. And so she had to learn the uncomfortability of challenging leaders and asking questions. And I said, if you use questions to challenge, you're edifying the room, and you may be edifying me and helping me see that this is a great point. We should lead in that direction. So I feel like in cultural differences where people are taught not to do that, and even gender differences, I think we're bridging a lot of those gaps. But I think that's what's great about leaders that encourage that behavior in other people. But there's still cultures in different tech communities that I think it's tough to do that challenging behavior. But if you can exhibit that, your company will, I think, always be better for doing that.
One of the other topics in the book that caught my attention was sort of the delicate balance between Gladwell's use of like culture and circumstances to explain phenomenon, and then stereotyping, right? Which we're sort of taught like stereotyping is bad, you don't want to do that. But at the same time, in certain cases, it can really help understand. I think Asians and math is one obvious example, and he provides two different explanations for why Asians tend to excel in math and be sort of 1 year or more ahead of North American students or European students. Part of it has to do with his explanation of the work ethic that comes from working rice fields, which is kind of a separate thing. I found that less compelling than his explanation of the language issue, which is that, our brains only have a certain amount of short-term memorization where we can instantly repeat something that we just heard. It's like 2 seconds or something like that, right? It's quite limited. And Asian numbers are expressed in much, much shorter terms and a much more coherent fashion, right? Like 14 versus 11 doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I think the example he uses is like 21 is 2 tens 1, 11 is 1 10 1. They have a very sort of linear, organized number system that makes it much shorter to express longer numbers as part of it. And again, just more rational. And so for younger children, they're a year ahead before they've even started school, basically, just from knowing numbers.
Yeah. I feel like, are you implementing this with your kids now?
I don't know that we're going to go to a 2 tens 1 expression of 21, but it is interesting. I think this is in line with your initial sort of comment about you wanted to understand how to be successful. Understanding our limitations and what creates those limitations is part of solving the problem. And maybe we won't solve like why North Americans lag behind in math today, but at least understanding that there's a language issue involved in that is good to know. Like what our ancestors did and the fact they didn't work rice fields, I don't know that that's something that we can overcome. But again, just getting back to the point about stereotypes, I just felt like it made me think a little bit about what is the fine line, where is the line between explaining a phenomenon based on culture and identity versus stereotyping, because obviously not all Asians are good in math, and we do have North Americans and Europeans who excel at math, right? And so we want to be careful of overusing that, but to understand the phenomenon is helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I feel like not everyone's always going to fit, again, within that distribution curve, and you're going to have different behaviors. But generally speaking, if you can try and help a majority of people in a certain way. I think he also talked a little bit about like affirmative action and culturally, and how he was seeing that as a way that initially some of the people that they were helping, he talks about in the book, get into law schools. So with minority people that were going into law schools, they were actually performing at a disadvantage. And so people were saying, see, this program doesn't work. But then when they actually graduated and left law school, everything equalized. And that even though the performance within their college performance may not have leveled up to these other individuals that were there, these people had the circumstantial differentiation that gave them that advantage. And then while they were able to be in that same environment, it was almost, how I saw it, was kind of like this incubator of, it levels out once you give them that equal opportunity. And so that's what's interesting, and a couple of different cultural aspects that he seems to talk about in his book.
That makes sense. I do feel like the struggle is what makes us stronger, right? So, and so those who have to struggle to get to the same place, when they're there, they're stronger than someone who's had an easy ride to get to that spot.
David and Goliath is his other book, and I know I probably not trying to make this all about just love great. Malcolm Gladwell, but he does such a phenomenal job about talking about how disadvantage is such a good thing. And it's kind of like the rice fields, where if you're working and slaving in these rice fields, that can be something that there's something good that could come from out of that.
Right.
And I grew up with dyslexia, and so I felt like that was always, I felt like it was such a disadvantage. But you learn later in life that these things are actually such an advantage to you, and that they have given you gifts of perseverance, of learning how to approach things from different angles. And that if we all just look at, okay, what are the disadvantages that I was given, and how do I use that to be my secret sauce that you bring in? So that could be our next one.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think, my takeaway from this book is that there's a lot of layers in the onion of what makes an outrageously successful person, and some of it are not intuitive things that Gladwell has sort of really carefully researched and dug up and presented. So that's great. On the other hand, I think it maybe overemphasized some of these other factors, because there are a lot of Canadian boys born in the first quarter of the year who've played hockey 10,000 hours, no doubt, and are never going to be at an excellent level, even though they played. Yeah. So I worry about like overemphasizing those factors, but I love this book. I thought it was a great recommendation, so thank you for that.
Of course.
Why don't you have the last word and give your final pitch? I think this whole chat has been a great sort of promotion for the book and learning about Gladwell, but go ahead.
Yeah. I think ultimately the way that he has a way of just teaching us what are those factors for success, and looking inward to figure out what are your things that are going to be your outliers, are really helpful. And I think you've also done a really good job of summarizing a lot of those key points as well. So ultimately I would say lean in and learn as much as you can about how you can get yourself to the equal playing field, and then from there you have some sort of your own advantage that you can use towards those.
Great. Thank you so much.